Let us start. I have the great pleasure of introducing the next speaker, Dr. Bernard Reisman, who both teaches at Brandeis and has a PhD from the same institution a number of years ago. He taught also at Loyola University of Illinois and also in my own university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And his field is Jewish community service, contemporary studies, contemporary Jewish studies. And his books include Adult Education Trips to Israel, which was published in 1993, and two previous books. And he just told me that he published an interesting monograph just recently on, you won't believe it, but you will believe it, the Jews of Alaska.
Both of them.
Affiliated. No, but it's a very...
Yes, but the program got cancelled.
Because it is called Life on the Frontier. And that indeed, I suppose, is the latest version of the American frontier. Not sure it's the last. And the topic for his talk now will be an agenda for postmodern Jews. Bernard Reisman.
I feel some rachmanis for you sitting a whole day and yet one more speaker before a break. So hang in. I'll try to be merciful, and you do know there is a break before dinner and then some more this evening. It was a few months ago when I received a call from Sherwin Wine, and I had never met Rabbi Wine before, but I knew of him and his work. And he invited me to this colloquium. And it was in the middle of summer, no classes and so on. I'm intrigued by a phenomenon that I knew very little about, the organization which he personally took such significant leadership in developing, secular humanism, and also tending to identify with folks who innovate and also tend to be on the fringe because they are not mainstream. I said yes. I also was attracted, and I must give credit to the distinguished assembly of faculty who are pluralists themselves and represent different ideologies. And that speaks to a certain security when you invite people who don't necessarily conform or adhere or think as you do. I also want to make mention of the warm reception that we outsiders received here and the splendid organization that went into planning this. I've been to lots of colloquia and symposia, and I can't think of any that was better organized and more attentive. I draw two observations relevant to what I want to talk about from this. The first is, it is a reflection of the high commitment and energy generated in the members of this congregation who took such an active role both in the design and also in the mechanics of spending their time welcoming those of us who were invited. And it also says something about an organizational ambiance and style that is conducive to the needs of Jews at the end of the 20th century. Among the things I want to talk about and largely focus on is what is, that was my title, the agenda for Jews today, who I happen to call postmodern. I'll try to explain that a little later. And how do you understand the needs of these particular people? And in particular, of unaffiliated Jews, especially since they are such a large majority of our numbers today. So that's the work I want to address with you. To get a sense of the task of understanding postmodern Jews, I need to explain what I call a watershed change on the assumption that today, in 1995, 5756, our calendar, we are going through a watershed change. By that I mean it is not incrementally different in the last couple of years than the prior few years, but it is dramatically different. And the challenges which confront us and the changing definition of being Jewish at this time needs to be thought of as watershed sea change. Consequently, the responses, the prescription, what do you do in the face of this, needs to be similarly dramatic, innovative, different from where we've been. And this is not atypical if you look at our several millennia of history. Jews throughout our history have been confronted with major challenges, threats to our continuity. Continuity is not a new phenomenon, and yet we have survived, perhaps because, maybe more so than any other ethnic religious culture in history, we have had that capacity to understand the need for change and to be creative in adapting to the new circumstances and the challenges which confronted us. So I want to try to explicate the challenge to our contemporary society. And in large measure, you've heard these initials used several times now, Shoshana certainly and Agon this morning. NJPS, the National Jewish Population Survey, 1990. It didn't cause the change. It gave us the data to realize something dramatic was happening in our society. Those data told us essentially that we seemed to be on a rapid path of assimilation. That is, more Jews were intermarrying. I was surprised. I don't think Egon mentioned the holy number, 52%. That is the number that within the prior 5 years are intermarrying, more than half. And of course, the other data, less people belong or unaffiliated, less observance of rituals, customs, less belonging to Jewish organizations. And all of this sounds pretty scary. We heard the percentages of the unaffiliated, and they were high. I wanted to flesh out a little bit because part of our task today is to understand who are the unaffiliated. So I'll mention some categories. On the top of the list are the mixed marrieds. Even though more than half are intermarrying today, it is primarily still of the younger generation. So when you count all Jews in America, about 1/3 are part of mixed marriages. And you heard some of the statistics about their involvement and their Jewish identity and commitments. Not quite like, of course, what one would expect from when two Jews marry. A second group is essentially what we speak of as the unaffiliated. They are Jewish, but they don't have anything to do, or very little to do, with Jewish organizations. And the point was made by several people. That makes them somewhat more at risk because there's no reinforcing and support system to make it likely they're going to hang in and be part of the Jewish community. A third growing group of unaffiliated, and here my work in Alaska carries it to an extreme, but there is a phenomenon, and that's why I was interested in studying Jews on the frontier. We have always thought of Jews as urban-centered people. And one could understand that. Jews like to be near a critical mass of other Jews to have places where they can come together and be with Jews and feel the comfort and the reassurance, and also to help educate the next generation. The new phenomenon is Jews moving outside of urban areas to what sociologists call areas of low Jewish density, to places like Vermont, Wyoming, Alaska. And it's a lifestyle thing. Once you could sit at your computer and have your private plane or access to internet, etc., you can also be on the fast track, but you can have a lifestyle that is quite attractive. And also, I would add, as Jews are more secure, they're less afraid of anti-Semitism and have the courage to live in these distant areas. What's uncertain, and the presumption is, when you move to those areas of low Jewish density away from the urban centers, does that lead to a decline in patterns of Jewish behaviors? In most cases so far, that seems to be the pattern. And Egon referred this morning to the different statistics for the West Coast, which has been in that pattern right up from California to Oregon. I'll talk a little bit about Alaska, which might have some surprising patterns for you. Two other groups, which I think we pay insufficient attention to, who somehow get lost. One are Israelis, sometimes called Yordim. It's hard to know how many are in this country. However many there are, and the estimates range anywhere from 150,000 to 300 or more hundred thousands, and they studiously avoid being part of the organized Jewish community. If they have a chevra, it tends to be the other Israelis in town. Yet, many of them have been here for decades. A colleague told me just a few days ago, a pattern is now reversing. It used to be, it was not trumpeted by Israeli authorities, more Jews were going on Yeridah, leaving Israel, especially coming to places like America, than American Jews or others from sophisticated countries were going on Aliyah to Israel. Apparently, within the last 6 months, that pattern seems to be reversing. And why is that so? Two facts going on in Israel today. One, the rise in the economy and the greater likelihood that I can have a reasonable economic beneficial lifestyle in Israel than I thought of before. And two, peace. And let's hope both continue. But nevertheless, we'll still have many Israelis in our country. Who's doing outreach to them? Are they reachable? The last group, the gay community. I think the Jewish community, the organized community, has been nowhere near as outreaching and welcoming of this population. Their numbers are hard to know, but there are a heck of a lot of them out there, more than most of us presume, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be welcoming and having them feel that they are bona fide members of our community. So, to get back to that notion of a watershed change and the dire predictions of the National Jewish Population Survey, what was the response in 1991 when the first reports came out of these findings? I would say the best word to characterize it would be despair. The Jewish leaders, on the one hand, said, it's all over. The presumed assimilation, which we thought might be going on, clearly is going on, and at a more rapid rate than we believed. And it appears that we're going to lose significant numbers, and mostly their concern was they assumed it was the younger generation who was most likely on the way out. And this was pretty frightening. And from despair, there was another uncharacteristic Jewish response. They became immobilized. They seemed to go from one meeting to another, one rabbinic sermon, one Jewish newspaper editorial, all repeating this, the droning on with the 52%, etc., etc. And it led to no action, except listening again and beating our breasts. But to the credit of our Jews and their instincts, 2 or 3 years later, there came to be a readiness to say, well, okay, this may be true. Now, let's try to do something about it. And things like continuity and new strategies and new call for designing new programs to address the challenges of these data from the national Jewish population. But also characteristically Jewish, there were 2 camps of what we should do next. And they have been labeled the pessimists and the optimists. First, the pessimists. They said, aha, we told you all along, we couldn't really, as a traditional community, maintain ourselves in the face of enlightenment. Those ideas could never permit a traditional society to last in its maintenance of traditional ideas. Rationality would undo it. Further, this would inevitably happen over time. There's something sociologists call the 3-generation theory. Actually, it was promulgated by a man named Hansen, not Jewish, studying Norwegians in Minnesota a couple of decades ago. Basically what it said, any minority community, ethnic, religious, who comes into a culture which has different ethnic or religious centrality can last for 3 generations. How do we count generations? I'll use my own family situation. My grandparents were born in Eastern Europe. They came here at the end of the 19th century. My parents born in New York. My grandparents, 1st generation. My parents born in New York, 2nd generation. I'm a 3rd generation. Elaine and my children, 4th generation. Our 4 kids now are starting to have grandchildren. They are actually 5th generation. The 3-generation theory went as far as 3 generations, and it said the following. 1st generation, eager to get a foothold, make a reasonable living, send my children to good schools, universities, perhaps they can do better, and indeed they did. 2nd generation, the title of that book, Making It, that is, their objective was to get a sufficient economic stability and acceptance in the society, and their 3rd generation children on the path to assimilation, fully incorporated in the values of the society, losing track of what grandma and grandpa brought, and the likelihood is that's the end of that ethnic religious community. And the National Jewish Population Survey seemed to suggest that this was the pattern. Now here's the problem. I told you about my grown-up 4th generation children. We are close now to where 4th and 5th generation American Jews are becoming the majority. Some of this was also not exactly as Hansen predicted for the 3rd generation. So one might say there now is a majority of Jews who do not seem to be in that downward cycle, but seem to have held and are starting back in an attraction to a Jewish lifestyle. That's a significant change. We don't have it fully confirmed, and I offer it as a hypothesis, although my own research data tend to be supportive of this. and there even is some indication in NJPS. In the fine print, Egon didn't call attention to this, but it's on his data. Surprisingly, people with more Jewish education actually seem to have more patterns of Jewish identity and observance of ritual than people with less. And that sort of goes against the assumptions of the three-generation theory that the combination of being fully part of the outside society in terms of generation and education would make it more likely that you would quickly move into the outside society and see your old country ways as irrelevant. So the strategy of the pessimists is, we're going to lose these people, these assimilating Jews. Let's go after the saving remnant, was referred to earlier. Those people who are in the core, the mainstream. They belong to the synagogues, they observe all the customs. Invest our money and energies in them, and in effect, let the unaffiliated and those who've said to us, we don't really want to be part of your community, they mean it, just let them drift out, and we can count on the committed core to maintain us. Now comes the optimists. I would call them also the minority party. And I guess I should put my bias up front. I consider myself an optimist. Indeed, out of that notion of despair not being a Jewish value, I also think pessimism doesn't belong to Jews. If we weren't optimists and didn't have that sense we could change things to sustain our future, I don't think we would have survived. So what is the rationale for the optimists? For one thing, they look at this group of unaffiliates. I call them marginals, or the community has called them marginal. It says they are on the edge and likely to drift off and out. If you look at these people and if you get to meet them, those 5 or 6 groups of people, the unaffiliated, you will find that they are a very attractive, high-powered, quality population. And I say to myself and to my colleagues, I'd love to get them in my community, and I think they would only enrich and add to the strength and quality of our community. Moreover, I always felt we were taught to welcome the strangers among us, to be sensitive to the outsiders. And I feel that sense of compassion, welcoming, and wanting to say, hey, come get more immersed in my community. I think you'll like it, and I think you can be helpful to us. So I want to put my time and energy in that important group of marginals, those unaffiliated. I'm also encouraged, because I don't want to also be naive, that they are interested. The word I use, this is a receptive population. I think the assumption of the pessimists is that Yiddishkeit, Jewishness, however defined, a Jewish identity, is not appealing or attractive to highly acculturated people. And I have found otherwise, and I'll tell you in a bit why I think that's the case. That they see being Jewish as something that can be meaningful even to 4th, 5th, highly educated people. Where do I get this information from? In part, the study I've been doing of Jews of Alaska. If one would assume there's ever a population that looks like they're moving out and away, one would assume moving up to that cold, dark, distant location would be grounds for giving it up, for saying being Jewish is unimportant. I don't imagine there are very many Jews up there. There aren't a heck of a lot, although there's more than 2. In fact, I've done a census. There's just under 3,000 spread through a large mass 1/5 the size of the lower 48, so they truly are in an area of low Jewish density. Guess what, folks? I used all the kinds of questions that the NJPS asked in a demographic survey of Alaskan Jews. My wife and I met with good numbers of Jews in 11 different communities. Their results, on the demographic data, are significantly beyond the Jewish identity salience of being Jewish measures of lower 48 Jews. And we thought it would be tough to get to meet them. When we came and announced to community leaders, hey, we're doing this, we'd like to meet you, they were delighted. They were so eager to meet somebody, to talk about what it means to be Jewish, and to talk about in their own little Jewish community group. Any Jewish community with 5 or more Jews has their own Jewish community group. In our audience today are the Chasens, Bert Chasen and his wife, who are people from here in Detroit. Their daughter, Lynn Chasen Kelly, a story to explain in a minute, lives in Sitka, Alaska. And they have a regularly meeting community group. They fight, they have their divisions among 19 couples. In fact, our visit promoted a major tension because we asked some questions about what did they want to do with their group, how important it was. And it happened, two groups emerged, the minimalists and the maximalists. They don't have the luxury of forming a second synagogue, however. But they worked it through because they need each other. That's the point I make. The sense of community is so vital because what they discovered when they got up there, the Jewishness, which was not totally unimportant, but not of consequence, now achieved greater salience for 2 reasons. The first, it afforded them an opportunity to find, like others, a sense of community. Their Hevra are the other Jews in the community. And secondly, they decide, much to their surprise, we want something for our children and to assure that they will continue to be Jews. So they put together, find the most knowledgeable person, you be the head of our school, so that we can provide education to our children. So Alaska, the Jews on the last frontier, the motto of the state, surprisingly are showing a high interest in Jewishness. And they are very receptive. Their problem is there's no support. There's 2 synagogues, a Lubavitch, they're every place, and a Reform synagogue in Anchorage. And that's it. So can they make it without support? And that yet remains to be seen. A second piece of research is done actually by a sociologist of all American baby boomers. It's a first-rate piece of work. It's called A Generation of Seekers, and the author is Wade Clark Ruth. And he asked the question, who are these baby boomers, and what about their children and that generation? This was initially the me generation, self-focused. And when he says, now talking about the generation they reared, who it is presumed would have been even more uncertain about any kind of connection to a religious community. Ruth uses, first of all, he calls them, as I mentioned, a generation of seekers. That means they're looking for something. What may be a little deceptive or unclear, they're also minimally affiliated, like our unaffiliates. But Ruth studies them more intensively and then comes up with a phrase, because I can't go through all the detail now. He says, they are believers without belonging, turned off by organized religion, but yet searching for something that will give them a sense of meaning and belief that they can find useful for their lives, but not with all the extraneous trappings of the religious institutions, which Ruth has a nice phrase for. He calls them the bland religious establishments of their youth. That won't capture their attention. That won't lead them to want to belong. And yet they continue to search, but not yet finding anything. I come now to the notion of this being an era of postmodernity, and tell you what I mean by that. To do so, I need to make the distinction, which I think is a critical one, between assimilation, I've used it 3 times this afternoon, and a word we haven't used, acculturation. Assimilation basically means you come with certain background and ideas, values, and identification which are different from the host majority culture. And that background and that culture is seen is less appealing and likely to be an impediment to your being accepted in the majority culture, which appears to be more attractive. And thus, you change your name, you straighten your nose, and you act and behave like the majority. So Rabinovitz, who is now Rab, blends well and is fully accepted by the American culture, and in time ceases to do anything Jewish. He and his heirs are assimilated former Jews. What is acculturation? And I would argue most Jews are acculturating and fewer assimilating in our generation. Acculturating Jews means they look at American society, the epitome of the best of Western thinking and enlightenment, and also its other material benefits, and they say, there are lots about this society that I would like to be part of, but, and this is where I think we can learn something from the 3rd and 4th generations, most of them are saying, we know it well enough because we are so immersed in that culture to realize it has its voids. And there are lots about that attractive culture that doesn't speak to us as thoughtful, highly educated young Jews. And I reiterate what Egon alluded to this morning. We are far and away the most educated population of any ethnic religious community. And it is exactly that highly educated 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation community which now has the understanding and immersion in America to say, yep, I want to have a lot to do with it, but I don't want it to be my soul, or maybe not even my primary identity. Indeed, the best of all worlds, I want a synthesis of being Jewish and American. And what is it that is attractive to from their Jewish culture that they find lacking in the American general society? I'm going to quickly highlight 6 voids. These are what I would call the agenda of a postmodern generation. Now, I want to just back up and say one more thing about postmodernity. It then says to me, we may be misperceiving the challenge of the 3rd and 4th generation. We have always thought it was fighting the inevitably losing battle against a culture that was far superior and would overwhelm the Jewish background. I am suggesting to you, in a postmodern era, that is not the issue. The issue is finding a way to synthesize 2 cultures, being American and being Jewish, and to accept as a given that being Jewish is not a liability or something to be shunned or cast off, but is viewed as a frontier that can enrich my life. With that perspective, you approach the unaffiliated with a different set of priorities. I suggest the 6 voids might give some ideas about that. The first void is the sense of loneliness. Someone used the word this morning, anomie. I don't feel connected. I don't belong. I'm in a transient society which is very mobile. I leave family, no longer live in the community in which I was born. Extended families are in short supply. I don't have my Gemeinschaft. That is, that primary network of people who care about me and to whom I would turn if I were in trouble. In Alaska, one person said to me, the Jewish community, I tell you why it's so important. If someone in my family got sick and I had to go to the phone, who would I turn to? It would be the people who are the 6 families who are in our Jewish community. That's their Gemeinschaft. Do enough Jews today have that sense of a connection to a community, a caring, loving community? 2, hyper-individualism. A sociologist at Boston University, a colleague named Peter Berger, said one of the values which we were plagued with from modernity as it took over from traditional societies was the heightening of attention to the individual, to the collective, which was seen as repressive and indeed may have been in traditional society. The collectives meaning the family, the community, religion, authorities, etc. They hemmed people in. Modernity suggested liberation. Loosen the bounds, the constraints inflicted by the collectives, and give the individual a chance to do their thing. Peter Berger says, in the era of postmodernity, individualism has gone perhaps too far. People have insufficient access to supportive collectives, and also makes a core mistake in understanding human nature. The idea that collectives are bad and the untrampled individual or the unrestricted individual is really the ideal state for the human species, I agree with Berger, is misreading the nature of the species. So, can we put some constraints on all for the individual and help people find collectives which will be accessible, sensitive, and supportive, and not constrained, and not believe that people are unwilling to be part of collectives? I think they are if they are the right collectives, and that's a challenge. One other issue, and it leads to something else I'm going to say. If people are so self-focused, they have no sense of responsibility for the larger collectives and ultimately society. And some of the tensions in contemporary life that we see around us could be explained by the unwillingness of people to think in broad terms. Third, a loss of autonomy. Somebody, Yaakov or some Zev, yesterday I spoke of, we live in a mega society where so much is decision-making centralized, and individuals feel, this almost sounds like the opposite of what I said before. Individuals seem to have little control over many aspects of their lives because the culture is shaped by large forces. And this is contrary to their abilities and their sophistication and their high education. So their potential is insufficiently tapped. So when you have a synagogue, for example, with 2,500 members, or you work in an organization where there are 3,000 people, how do you feel a sense of mastery, a sense of controlling your destiny, or using your potential to its fullest? What I take from this in the postmodern organization is that we will seek to give people opportunities to shape their organization. That was the thing I said about the Birmingham Temple that gave me the sense people felt ownership, felt empowered, and as a consequence you have their loyalty, and this can then be a transforming kind of experience. People don't want another passive role for themselves. And that kind of view of organizations of postmodernity needs to be also incorporated. 4, a distrust of authority. Grows out of some of this pattern I had just described. It's best exemplified by a bumper sticker. I believe bumper stickers tell you a lot about a culture. There's a young student who parks in the same lot with me at Brandeis, so unfortunately I have to see this sticker all the time. It says, distrust authority. Now, that's a simple recipe. Our problem is because all the authorities are likely to want to do us in, and therefore our lives are weakened as a result. But when you ask yourself, who are authorities in society? They're people like you and me who are parents. We are authorities. They are your teachers, your rabbis, the leaders of your the organizations you belong to, the boss, the community leaders. Now, are all of them ipso facto, by virtue of the fact that they occupy a seat of authority, presumed to be working against the best interests of the collective? Well, some folks would say yes. And indeed, there are some folks who misuse their stewardship. But most people work at it with the intent of being helpful. Part of the problem is we really haven't learned how to use authority in a constructive, empowering, and responsible way. If we continue to distrust it and not impart, particularly in the place where you best learn what authority is about, the family, about benevolent support of authority, then you're going to be hard-pressed to exercise it when you have the opportunity as an adult. Number 5, and these all follow, a lack of civility in contemporary life. Read the newspaper if you want the midrash on this one. Blacks and whites, Bosnians, East Europeans, Arabs and Israelis. You know all the different and increasingly acrimonious relationships. Is this the way it always has to be? To me, it seems like tribalism gone berserk. And yet, we live in a global village. So those are two trends that somehow we have to find a way to do differently. What worries me also, we Jews, within our own community, our intra-group relations leave a lot to be desired. I needn't point them out to you. You know that phenomenon. How does that feel for your kids when this principled, chosen people can't get their own act together, where Orthodox hate and despise Reform and vice versa, and you can pretty well, you name the subdivisions and the tensions among them is hardly exemplary. Can we set an example? Can we learn to rise above our differences, both internally first, and then help set a model? And that's why I'm so excited by the tentative peace treaty. If the Jews and Arabs can bring it off, maybe those in Northern Ireland and the Bosnians and so on. And here, nobody, in my view, has said it better than the sage Hillel in terms of how do you find that balance between tribal attentiveness and also some concern for the universal larger system. If I am not for myself, what am I? But if I am only for myself, who am I? I may have mixed that a little bit. I got this. And then he adds, I got the primary attention, take care of your own vineyard first. And be sure that that's a principled, responsible community. That will then give you the incentive and the energy and the sense of responsibility to try to help and to be attentive to, yikes, the larger community. Okay, a sixth and final, and this perhaps will be the most controversial. And I'm trying to report it as honestly as I can, as I've seen it in my research. The sixth void is the lack of meaning, purpose, and what is popularly called spirituality. There's no national magazine in America that hasn't had a front page story on the search for spirituality. Some people denigrate this and say it's fluff. I've spoken with a lot of people. I'm talking largely young people, the children of the baby boomers, the generation of seekers. I hear them saying, and when I push them, I'm looking for something that's more than my job, my monetary goals, material acquisitions, and also the sense that there's something larger than the self. These are the me generation who I suggest to you were troubled by their being so unrestrained that they felt the need for boundaries and were looking for some way of finding a sense, a reason to discipline themselves, to be responsible for others, and also the sense there was something larger than themselves in the universe that they wanted to find out more about. I'm going to read a couple of quotes that give a sense of this. This is from Walker Percy, contemporary thinker, describing today's life in today's society. We live not in an age of enlightenment, but in an age of not knowing what to do. Amplified by Václav Havel, president of Czechoslovakia, a very thoughtful man. He says, the awareness of our being, he was now talking about, first, the world of our experiences seems chaotic, disconnected, confusing. We do not exactly know what to do with ourselves. And therefore, he says, what is it we might be doing and where are we heading? And he too speaks of some search for meaning and purpose. And I think this is important because we dare not mention the G word, but yet, and the spiritual searchers don't, when you ask them, they're very loath to say God because nobody knows what they're talking about, because there's no conversations about God and what it's about. I suggested earlier this morning, I think there are very few people who think it's about a man sitting up in the heavens who's answering prayers or telling us what it's all about. And I think these people are too. Here's Havel's suggestion of what that spirituality notion is. It is the awareness of our being anchored in the earth and the universe. The awareness that we are not here alone, nor for ourselves alone, but that we are an integral part of higher, mysterious entities against whom it is not advisable to blaspheme. Now, does he mean that exactly literally, or are those metaphoric statements that suggest it's useful for people to be willing to accept some constraints, just as they recognize the beauty and order of nature, about which they have no quarrel, and therefore wonder about whether that could also be extended to their lives in a more broad sense. So my final concluding question, before I get from Yehuda a new note that says I'm -1, I think our challenge is to find a balance between some standards, some meaning, some purpose in the Jewishness we present. I think being inclusive and welcoming is great, but there ought to be some parameters. The word that we heard from Shoshana last night, who wants to belong to a club that doesn't have any standards, or I suggest ideology. A community is vital, and you heard me put that at the top of my list, but I don't know of any community that doesn't cohere around an ideology that can speak to people and their needs. And lastly, My goal, and we haven't heard this enough or at all, is not to save any Jewish institution. And I think we all would agree to that. The question is, are we factoring into our deliberation the goal of saving the Jewish people? And do we ask ourselves, what strategy will make it likely that our children and their children will continue to be Jews, and that the Jewish heritage will not end in our generation or the next one or the other?